So one case I talk about happened in the 9th of February in 1855 in the estuary in South Devon in England, in the southwest of England. And basically, people of that area woke up to find 100 miles of cloven hoof footprints set in the deep snow. Not just kind of like on the road, they went up houses, they went across roofs, they went down, they went over walls, right, everywhere. And they got known as the Devil's Footprints. And they were never really explained.
Welcome back. I'm here again with Darragh Mason. Darragh, welcome back.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me again.
All right, the Dark Man. I think when we ended, we had not talked about the trickster element, and I think a number of potentially other things, but if we could just kind of continue with where we left off.
Yeah. So the trickster element is kind of one of the bits of the pattern that I identified in the last show I went over it, but just to refresh people's memory, 5 elements that I noticed kind of made up of dark man activity. One of those would be a dark appearance or appellation. So it would be called Black John or something like that. Shape-shifting, trickster nature, and an interrupted journey. It's called the interceptor. So a journey that would be somehow deviated off course. When people are in between one place and another, we'd somehow be led astray. And then the final one would be sex and sexual interest in human beings. So I would say the way to how you would identify if the dark man is in a story or in folklore or indeed turns up in someone's life is, are there a cluster of those in it? You know, that doesn't tell us anything about motivation, doesn't tell anything about what it is. It's just some kind of cosmic force. I call it a living archetype, some description. Perhaps it's a type of god, you know. But anyway, that's by the trickster element. So I suppose if we look at folklore in general, each kind of pantheon of gods has a type of figure like this. All right. And what do the tricksters do? Well, they kind of turn things on their head. They kind of upset the apple cart. You know, you might have this, you know, all-powerful god. You know, you've got your Zeus or your Odins, and yet they'll have a trickster in their family often who will cause all kinds of problems and will cause things to transform, will cause things to change. So I would say what they are is they're a catalyst for change. They prevent stagnation, and it kind of forces those around it to change as well. So is it one of those things that you can go, was it good or bad? So, well, how easy was the change? Was it awful? You know, was it really difficult? It depends who you ask, you know, depends. Again, these things, it tends to be they're transmoral. The point of it is to cause the change. The point of it is to change perception. So if we talk about the Greek pantheon, then it's Hermes, you know, and Hermes people recognize for having kind of like the winged helmet or winged heels. He will often have a wand, which is called a caduceus, which is depicted in modern, well, I don't say modern, but it's usually depicted as being kind of a wand with 2 intertwined snakes up it, with wings and then the sun at the top. In some of the older depictions of Hermes, it's depicted as simply a staff with a fork at the top, right? Which, incidentally, is exactly how a witch's stang is the same thing. So a witch's staff, the staff a witch would use is called a stang, and it's a bifurcated stick. So stick, 2 bits out.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
It looks very much the same way the old caduceus were displayed on ancient kind of Greek urns and pottery and what have you. Anyway, when Hermes is born, he steals his brother Apollo's cattle and eats them as well. So he has a right good picnic, and I think he does something along the lines of like he puts on shoes that make the hooves point backwards and walks away. So he does all this stuff to try and confuse Apollo. And when he gets, Apollo catches up with him and accuses him of stealing his cattle. And the infant Hermes lies through his teeth, just absolutely, completely confusing Apollo, lying through his teeth. Zeus finds this hilarious, right? And Apollo is demanding recompense and, punish this terrible infant. And essentially, like in some stories, Hermes is a newborn when he's doing all this, right? So anyway, Apollo makes him apologize, and then to kind of bridge the gap and to kind of pay back for the cattle he stole, Hermes makes a lyre out of the sinews of the cattle and the rib bones and gives that to Apollo, and Apollo becomes known for carrying a lyre. So that's the change. So Apollo loses his cattle, but he gains the lyre, and that's kind of some of that, how that turns everything on its head and change. Now, Loki is a similar figure from people be very familiar with from the Marvel films, but he's from the Norse pantheon. And incidentally, he's a slightly different bloodline to the rest of I think they're called the Aesir gods, right? He's part ice giant. So, and that kind of denotes his otherness. But he's a shapeshifter. He causes chaos all the time, but he causes change. So his action, the trickster actions, are the ones that they kind of create the conditions and the circumstance where the first domino falls. And the hero goes on the journey, that there's life and death and all these things unfold. But the trickster creates the conditions where the first domino falls. Now, there's a couple of cases I kind of pull out in my book about tricksters and weirdness. And if we also think about the trickster, not just in terms of events, but in terms of consciousness. So something very strange happens, something very odd happens, and it changes how you perceive the world around you. Some of the things that we've discussed, about kind of owls turning up and all that kind of stuff, and to the point where you're like, why does that keep happening? Why are owls popping up in my life all the time? That has a tricksterish vibe to it. You'll also spot like absurdities, that will, an absurd level on top of a synchronicity. That to me is like, that's the fingerprints of that trickster energy.
Like a Russian ICBM being named after you. Like that kind of absurdity.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. For folks who listen to our past discussion very quickly, Oreshnik, if you just look it up, it means, it's a Slavic term, either Bulgarian or Russian. It means someone who lives near a hazelnut or walnut grove. It's also a surname in Russian, and it effectively means it's the, if Anglo-Saxon, the term for that is Hazlett, Oreshnik is the Russian equivalent. So anyway, I stumbled into that one, but that was weird.
So there's a couple of cases that I think kind of highlight the relationship between the trickster and the dark man. So there's always that kind of like devilish quality to the trickster. Okay, so it's that, well, you got to check your wallet after you come up with the trickster. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's a similar thing. When you get these stories about people making kind of like deals with the folkloric devil, there's always a sting in the tail, right? There's always something that's been taken hyper literal, but there's something that's been kind of, inverted, but still kind of falls within the boundaries. That's the trickster element. Okay. So one case I talk about happened in the 9th of February in 1855 in the estuary in South Devon in England, in the southwest of England. And basically the people of that area woke up to find 100 miles of cloven hoof footprints set in the deep snow. Not just kind of like on the road. They went up houses, they went across roofs, they went down, they went over walls, right? everywhere. And they got known as the devil's footprints. And they were never really explained.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
All right, so then when we look at that,
and was this actually documented? Like there?
Yeah. There's newspaper clippings about it. Yeah, like they have no idea what happened with it, and it's one of those things that, you know, if it was human beings doing it, then, you know, fair play to them. They were committed to walking around in the deep snow across the night, across roofs, you know, and never getting caught and baffling everybody. You know, but what does an event like that do? So you wake up and you see like 100 miles across your roof of cloven footprints. What are you going to think? you're going to think, well, the devil rides out. You know, he's been busy. You know, and the real impact of that when I talk about consciousness is that makes things real for you. That makes superstitions real. You know, or at least there's enough doubt in it for you to have a lot of discomfort, mental discomfort, right? You're like, fuck. Sorry, I don't know if I'm going to swear, but you know, that you're in that headspace. Now, you pull the thread on that a little bit and we get more and more of these events, more and more superstitions around the devil as a dark man. Now, not long after the devil's footprints, we have a thing called the Swansea Devil. So the Swansea being a town in Wales. So in the 1890s, the town of Swansea, the council decided that its church, St. Mary, should be rebuilt. And legend has it that a local architect applied for the job, but was beaten to the job by a more acclaimed, more famous architect of the time called Sir Arthur Blomfield. And they were thrilled to have such a kind of prestigious name attached to the project. They immediately accepted Blomfield's proposal, and the local architect, he got the hump. You know, he wasn't very happy with this. And he basically bought the buildings, the land across from the church. The church was built, and he put a carved wooden devil up on the eaves, staring directly at the church. Right? One of the things I love about this, it's so committed in its pettiness for revenge. It's just like literally bought the buildings across from it, rebuilt them with a devil purposely facing this new church. So, and then a local man is said to have prophesied that kind of when your church is destroyed and burnt to the ground, my devil will remain laughing, right? And then in the World War II, St. Mary's Church was destroyed in a German bombing raid. And who was watching the smouldering ruins? But the devil sitting up there. And that devil still exists. It kind of was sold and, you know, ended up in kind of an antique place. But I think it's now on display in Swansea in Wales. So that's kind of, you know, that urban mythos around kind of like the local leadership not getting their way, you know. So it upsets the balance of authority. Now, there's two other kind of big, kind of more well-known bits around tricksters that I kind of would like to reflect on. And probably, in my opinion, the most famous of all time would be the Pied Piper. So for those who aren't familiar with the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, Hamelin was a town in Germany. The story, that the earliest surviving written version of the stories is around 1370. And it's literally kind of as part of an endnote in a copy of Henrik von Herod's Catans Orus, which is a Latin book of prayer, if I remember correctly. But it describes, it's written in Latin at the back of the book, and it describes at the time of terrible despair in the town, a handsome man arrives in possession of a silver flute and is dressed in pied, like multiple colours. And essentially we know the kind of events unfold. So he is hired by the mayor of the town to remove the rats. The town's overrun with rats, and he does so. So using his flute, he plays an air, and the rats follow him, where he takes them to the local river where they all drown. Right, so he demonstrates mastery over animals. And the silver flute kind of shows wealth, and silver is as a metal that's kind of often associated with, and a flute and a pipe, you know, is often associated with fairies. But essentially, he's a handsome stranger that comes into town, does this job immediately that the town was struggling with for a long time they couldn't resolve, even using kind of conventional rat traps and rat catchers and what have you. But they'd made a contract, they'd made a deal. What does the mayor do? He rescinds on the deal. So tries to shortchange the Pied Piper once the problem's gone. And the Pied Piper doesn't take kindly to this and takes the most appalling revenge imaginable. You know, we're still talking about it centuries later, where he plays an air and the children follow him, dancing wildly. And off he goes, and he leads them up to a cave in the mountainside, a place called Cavalry. And the cave wall is said to open, and that there was a child following behind who was said to have been lame and couldn't keep up with the other ones as they danced through the doorway into what I would argue would be fairyland. But he said he could see another world in there, and then the door is closed and the children were never seen again. And that's a terrible, terrible punishment that was dealt out by this type of trickster. And he showed mastery over human beings as well, to command their minds, put them into a trance and abduct all these children. So you can see the strangeness in that story. And the trickster teaches you a lesson, but he's a Pied Piper. You know, when you think about what clowns used to wear in the court of kings. So the clowns in the court would represent they would represent an element of that trickster energy where they tell the truth. That was the joke. They couldn't be punished, but they tell the truth. Often kind of maybe revealing jokes about, you know, lords and ladies who were, say, having indiscreet affairs. Perhaps jokes about that from the court jester would be similar. And again, the similar appearance. There's the Pied Piper being these kind of diamond patterns of multicolored cloth. So it's a clownish depiction that we get with the Pied Piper. Now, the final one that I kind of wanted to talk to was Spring Heel Jack. Now, people may or may not be familiar with Spring Heel Jack, but this was a very strange, devilish phenomena that basically kind of pestered Victorian England, particularly London, but it happened all over the UK. So, in this devilish appearance and the ability to leap and bound great heights, so 12 foot into the air, could jump. And it first appeared in the 1800s in October. Yeah, first appeared in the 1800s, and kind of the famous cases in October 1837, a young woman by the name of Mary Stevens was accosted while walking through London's Clapham Common, which is a big park in South London. And her clothes were ripped by this creature, and she was touched by her attacker's claws when he whipped her clothes. And she reported it being cold and clammy as a corpse. Right? And that's detail I pull out, particularly in the book, because there's constant references to an ice cold touch, right? And in some of the witches' confessions, when they talk about having what they call carnal dealings with the dark man, they describe intercourse being him being ice cold within them, right? And having an ice cold touch. So it's just an interesting detail that we find the same with Spring Heel Jack. In 1838, 18-year-old Jane Ossip was attacked. This was really, really sensationalized by the papers, or like her description fitted that of the earlier description given by Mary Stevens, like the same phantom appearance. But she gave an additional detail that this being could spat blue and white fire into her face and kind of temporarily blinded her. But where does the trickster element come into this? And there's two bits that I think that are really interesting in this. So when this is happening, this is at the height of the British Empire, right? The height of kind of like the industrial might of the British Empire. And we'd had a huge migration from people from the land into cities, right? To work in factories, to work in textile factories, work in iron smelting, factories, all this kind of stuff. Huge migration, total change of society in a very short space of time. Now, the empire was also, it also thought about itself as being kind of rational and the kind of the epitome of civility. And often the kind of the rationale that was given for their expansion as an empire was, well, Britain will be good for the colonies. We'll be good for these people because we can teach them how to be proper and rational and, scientific. This is why we're going to slaughter them in our thousands. So that was a rationale for expansion, for colonialism, and what have you. Now, at the same time, while they're, talking about people in the developing world, maybe in tribal cultures, having what they would kind of concern infantile beliefs in spirits and devils and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, back in the heart of the empire, back in London, people are spotting this devil fire-breathing creature bounding across Victorian rooftops, attacking women in the parks. So it's the devil followed them from the countryside and from the wilds into the towns and was showing it's alive and well. This bugaboo was alive and well. Now, and as if to kind of labor the point, the last cluster of sightings was in 1877. So we can see this over like a 40, 50 year period. Incidentally, there was a sighting in London in like 2000s, in the 2000s, of this 9 foot tall black figure bounding across the road in huge leaps in one of the areas around North London. But anyway, the last cluster of sightings was in a place called Aldershot. So Aldershot was the biggest garrison in the southeast of England, right? It was known as the home of the British Army, and which then was the most powerful military force in the world. And Aldershot was home to roughly 10,000 troops, right? So it's a big garrison. Now, what repeatedly was happening 2 centuries around this time, well, this is the trickster stuff, right? It's funny, it's preposterous. What would happen is there'd be a sentry on duty. This thing will come bounding out of the darkness, leaping 12 foot towards it, and basically slap the sentry in the face, right? And bound off backwards, into the darkness. And like the sentry would fire after it and saying firing into the darkness after it. And this would happen repeatedly. Sometimes, I think there was, if I remember correctly, there was one case of like landing on top of the sentry box, reaching under and again slapping the sentry in the face and then bounding off again. And what did the sentry say? When the touch was like ice cold. So it's making a mockery of the might of the British Empire. And this being at the time when the sun didn't set on the British Empire, it was a huge, vast, expansive empire. So that's kind of the trickster element. It's pointing out absurdities. It's pointing out things that shouldn't happen. But it's reminding authorities that it's just perception. Their authority is perceived. Life can go in the most screwy directions. The most strange things can happen that will invert the order. They upset the apple cart, and that is their function. And that absolutely seems to be part of what an element of the dark man does, or what I would call the mercurial dark man.
No, I mean Mercury is
exactly
the same as Hermes, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's just Roman versus Greek.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, in a modern context, how does this translate?
Well, I think it's looking out for those absurd events, the events that make you laugh at something, they undermine it, and I would say you look at a lot of the modern comedians who are kind of maybe, making jokes about stuff that people can't talk about, or pointing out absurdity through their comedy, so I think that's where we see a similar energy. I'm sure we'll see more. I think when we see like advanced software being put out to do a specific job, and our leaders are telling us this is very important, and then 2 days later it's hacked by a 15-year-old kid. That's a trickster event. Mm-hmm. It's like some 15-year-old kid, cripples the stock exchange. That's a trickster event. It comes completely out of nowhere and just turns everything on its head. And this is where, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
When we have this whole thing where it's like, the gods laugh at plans. That's what I mean. It's like when something seems like, well, there's no hope, where this is the way it is, it's always going to be like this. This is why you should never lose hope, because you just don't know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Because out of nowhere, I mean, it may not happen, but that's the trickster, and it's, you can't expect it to do what you think it's going to do, because it almost is like this unbelievable level of creativity, where you would never expect what's going to occur. It's almost, I would say, it's one of those things that's almost impossible to expect it.
Yeah, I think we need that now more than ever, because you have these like very serious people doing very disturbing things, and all the while lying about it openly.
Yeah, well, I think something we'll see it. And when it happens, you'll probably recognize it now. That's the trickster energy. But even if you think about how your own perception has changed, that's the trickster energy. Now that you kind of like will go, that's what that is. Even that's a change in your own perception. Your whole mental construct of how things work has changed. So it's fascinating stuff. But it's one of those things that, like, you got to be careful getting close to that kind of thing, because, the trickster's wild. It's just like, that is a fiery energy. That's something that can just get out of control real quick, you think you're friends with it. I don't think that thinks this, I'm not sure the trickster thinks the same way, it's
just chaos.
Yeah, pretty much, and like every culture has this type of figure, like I think it's Anansi the spider from West Africa. You've got, I think it's coyote and rabbit, or it might be hare in Native American, same type of figures, but it's this, they almost create the world. They create they stir the primordial soup by creating this energy that brings out change, but duck and cover when it's happening.
Yeah, try to avoid it.
Yeah.
Any other salient aspects of the Dark Man that we haven't gotten into yet?
Well, the shape-shifting element is significant. You see that in the stories repeatedly. Figure will appear as one thing and then kind of display as another. I can't recall if we went over the witch trials that much the last time.
I don't think we went into much detail at all. I think you made reference to them in passing, but that's
right,
about it.
Right. Well, in part of my research, I went into a lot of work trawling through the survey of Scottish witchcraft. So that's a resource of the history of witchcraft, right? So, and witch hunting in Scotland. So there's like nearly 4,000 individuals, all of whom are known to be accused of witchcraft in early modern Scotland, are included in that database. And there's information on kind of when and where they were accused, their testimonies, which is just this absolute dynamite database of stuff, and kind of what happened to them, right? So I went through this, did a number of different search terms that I thought would throw up something, and I found dozens, and that, the Dark Man is not present, not remotely. There's dozens of accounts, right, of a figure though matching his description, or some where I'd pick up at least two or a couple of those 5 things, right, the pattern. Incidentally, a green man was also found an awful lot, right? So, and the reason I bring this up, though, the green man, is that, like, when we think about kind of witchcraft and the Dark Man, right, you start to think devil and you start to think evil, right? Or you're witch and you start to think evil, right? You've got to get out of that simple binary with it, right? Don't get me wrong, those things can behave appallingly, absolutely, but it's not always the case. It's more to do, in my opinion, with the natural world, right? And witchcraft, I would say, in some forms, is closer to being interacting with that natural world, or witch interacts with the natural world, and it's probably a form of early paganism, right? And that's what I think a lot of research suggests, right? But bearing in mind that when the witch trials were happening, you're talking about a very inflexible mindset, right? Where it's either God or it's evil. There's no kind of room for discussion. So it's just an important context. Anyway, so here's a number of different accounts that I've pulled out that kind of represent this. So Margaret Alexander, she was tried in 1647. She referred to a man in black clothes who made her go forward. She spoke to the man of being the king of the fairies, whom she had sex with. And when pressed, she said his physical nature was cold. We see those themes again. So, and in the mythology, I think I mentioned it last time, mythology, we find this dark figure, seems to be the king of the fairies, the lord of the dead, and the folkloric devil. So it's got all these kind of psychopompic, otherish qualities. That's why I say it's like, it's not just this simple, it's the devil. It's way more than that, right? And we've been interacting with it for a very long time. The next one is another lady called Margaret, this time Margaret Allen, and she was tried in 1661. And she had a servant testify against her. She saw a black man go into Margaret's room and appear to move around like he had hooves. And Margaret was banished. I forgot to mention when I mentioned that they're kind of the 5 elements: shape-shifting and composite being nature. So part different animals. So I think last time we spoke about kind of like the owl face with the antlers and, you know, and like the fox's ears. So it's like that composite body. So that's one thing to look out for as well. Then Thomas Black, Margaret was banished. Thomas Black, tried in 1661. So the devil appeared to him at night while he was in bed. And he went on to describe the devil as lying upon him heavily in the shape of a man. Thomas was executed by strangulation and burnt. So the lying on top of him with a weight is interesting, because that's where we get the word nightmare from. So the mare in nightmare has nothing to do with horses. Mare has got to do with an archaic German word meaning kind of weight or weighted upon. So it's actually talking about this experience of having a weight pressing down to the point where you can't move. And that's what the term nightmare is actually referring to. Agnes Clarkson, she was tried in 1649 and spoke of how her home was filled with a black mist when she first refused to join the devil. And when questioned as to how she renounced her baptism, she explained that this was done through carnal dealings, sex with the dark man. Her faith is unknown. Margaret Jackson, tried in 1677, described the devil as a black man with a bluish band, white cuffs and hoggers, which are kind of leg covers. He wore no shoes and had cloven feet. She was visited in bed by a spirit who looked like her dead husband, but then later realized it was the devil. Margaret was executed by strangulation and burned. So we get the shape-shifting there as well. And widow Christian Patterson, she was tried in 1661. So the devil changed from a beast to a man to get into bed with her. And she gave a detailed account of sex with him. And Christian was executed by strangulation and burned. And you see, you've got the shape-shifting in there as well. And then you've the most famous account of all of that, which is Isabel Gowdy. And in 1662, Isabel confessed to witchcraft in Uldern in Scotland. And she made, I think it was 3 or 4 confessions over a 6-week period. I think it was 4. And it's unknown what happened to her. But her like vivid and lurid confession is startling in its detail. You know, and she describes the devil sucking blood from her devil's mark and sprinkling blood over to baptize her, and renames her, that they had intercourse, that he felt like a spring, like ice cold spring water inside of her. Described him as immense, his sexual organ being immense. And he would go from young woman to young woman in the Sabbath, like a stud horse. And yeah, just extraordinary stuff, you know. But one of the things that kind of blew my mind was when I did a lot of research into Irish folklore, we have multiple cases of a powerful figure with a dark appellation who would, using magic, a hazel wand, transform a fairy woman into a deer, right? And that deer would be used to trick the Fianna, these Irish heroes, to take some course of action. And that might mean bringing them to the Don Dove, the dove meaning black, Don Dove's kingdom of the dead, and that kind of thing, right? Now here we have the opposite, where the dark man, who they called Black John in this case, appearing And Isabel describes him as that sometimes he would appear as a deer, or sometimes he would have shoes or booties on, sometimes he would have none, but he would have cloven feet, or sometimes he would come in the form of a ray, right, which is an old word for a roe deer. He would come in that form, and sometimes they would copulate when he was in that form. They talked about shape-shifting into a hare, into a crow, into a dog, and subsuming these animal forms. And it's startling, but one of the things, and you might reflect on that, go, yeah, but that's the opposite of what happens in the mythology. And it was not the opposite. It's an inversion, right? The researcher Joshua Cutchin, in his incredible work, Ecology of Souls, talks about inversion being representation when you're in this kind of fairy world. Like, for example, he talks about like the fairies are ever leaving and extraterrestrials are ever arriving, in their respective folklore. We get all those kind of that inversion, but they're very similar, right? Anyway, so, I believe that aspect, that sexual aspect too, and that mystery around the dark man and his interaction with the witches, that it's that sex that's experienced is some kind of rite in honor of creation. So you remember in the last time we spoke about kind of like the cairns and how the shortest day of the year, which we're approaching, the ones in Ireland, the sun, the solar phallus would penetrate the cairn being the vulva of the earth to start life over again. Right? So it's constant cycle of these motifs of like life and death, and in this case, like the act of creation, the act of copulation being an act of creation. So yeah, and like the stuff in there, this is like in, was it 1662? The stuff in the Confessions is wild, so you can imagine the kind of like puritanical, Presbyterian lords and officials hearing this stuff, like probably sweating as they're writing down the confession, and like, but these were the poorest of the poor. These were like subsistence farmers living in sod huts, like immensely impoverished. And life in that kind of pastoral, early modern Britain, same as it was in Ireland, was really tough. A bad crop and people dying, and it wasn't, I think 200 years after that, there was the Irish famine, where the country was decimated.
Yeah, that was the difference was that was deliberate.
Yeah, that's a huge difference. But when you've got like that level of impoverishment where you're hanging by a fingernail, in these cold, wet islands, off the periphery of Europe, life is hard. And they were, they're somewhere between, subsistence farmers, brutal. They're hanging on to life by a fingernail, somewhere between serfdom and starvation all the time. These types of communities hedge their bets. They pray to God, to salvation, but they pray to the devil for survival. So it's a dual practice. That goes back to the Puck Fair. It's a dual practice. They have Christian practices, but all this pagan stuff is coming through. And in the pagan stuff, there's a dark man, amongst other gods. There's plenty others in those pagan rituals, but those, formidable nature spirits, like, are there. They take a whole range of forms.
How has it evolved in modern Ireland today?
I mean, the stuff's still there. Like, people are always seeing stuff in Ireland, It's obviously, very modern country with all the attributes of modern culture, but, you shake a tree and a fairy falls out, or someone's seen it. It's an interesting place. Like, up into the 90s, like for the EU, they were funding all these new roads and motorways through Ireland. And one was going down in County Clare, and a fairy tree was in its path. And the workers wouldn't cut the tree down, and this went on for ages. I think the road was diverted. Someone vandalized the tree years afterwards. There you go. Like, but Ireland's a very superstitious place still. And there's something in our psyche where, you know, people will laugh about, yeah, whatever, fairies and leprechauns, come on, what are you talking about? But they still won't do the taboos. Do you know what I mean? They'll kind of laugh about it and be like, yeah, it's total rubbish. Can we stop talking about it now? You know, or like, you know, there's still that kind of element to the culture. You know, I think so anyway. Maybe it's just me. But yeah, I mean, there's still accounts of people seeing stuff, you know, dark figures going across the boglands, all that kind of thing. It's still a haunted island for sure.
Any particular hotspots or places that
the clues are in the names.
Phenomena?
The clues are in the names, right? This is a fabulous book called Mankin Mansion. I don't know if you can see that. It's all blurry.
Yeah, it's a little blurry, but
yeah. But it's called Wolfmen and Waterhounds, and Myths, Monsters, and Magic of Ireland. It's beautifully illustrated by a guy called Steve Dugan, who sent me this. But when we look at Irish place names, right, key locations, right, the names in the original Irish, right, if you understand them from Gaelic perspective, tell you the story of the places. And in fact, there's a series of books called the Metrical Din Seachnas, which were a collection of the origin of place names of towns and townlands in Ireland, written down by monks that are entirely mythological, right? They're kind of like a mythological history of places. But let me just dig out here a couple of these place names, because they're telling you a little bit about what was going on in the area. Okay, right. So place names. So Annashgall in County Kerry is from Awan na Sgall, which means River of the Phantom. Then Glengesh, County Donegal, is from Glengesh, meaning Taboo Valley. So this would be generally accepted to be something to do with the Walking Dead, who are known to haunt that valley. Drumarach in County Fermanagh, from Drum Arach, Ridge of the Apparition, Ridge of the Monster or the supernatural being. Glenascall, County Galway, from Glen non Scoil, Valley of the Phantom. Right. So the place names are there. And you'll see that, remember we spoke about the puck the last time, the puck and the puka, right? You see that all across Western Europe, a variant of that word, right? Like in Finland, you've got kind of a pukki. The Finnish is, I have a good friend of mine is Finnish. I always find Finnish almost hilarious to listen to. It's almost like clicks and whistles, little fairy language.
Well, I mean, it's like a Turkic, like Hungarian. It's a weird.
It's
weird how it got there.
Yeah,
and Turkic. Yeah, it's weird.
Very strange. But they. Like
it's not a Scandinavian language at all. That's the thing.
No, remotely.
Understand, right?
Yeah, not remotely. But it has a variant of that word in it, like nuki puki, right? Which again is wonderful to say, is a weird kind of Christmas goat, right? So it's like a kind of a goated figure that goes around door to door around Christmas time. It's like a Yule goat is what it is. So some sort of horned animal spirit that goes door to door around the same time. And just like you got kind of Krampus in Austria. So, I would say that those figures are dark man adjacent. They would probably come under that banner, What does Krampus do? He goes door to door as this, humanoid, horned, devil-looking thing to threaten bad children. That's what it's about. If you're a bad kid, Krampus is coming for you, not Santa Claus. So there's just kind of, again, but Santa Claus is around the same time. So it's kind of like the good and bad. There's a little play, light and dark, going on together. But the place names you will find all over the place. And it's not necessarily, it has to be a place that's there for 2,000 years. There's lots of places in America that are called the Devil's Ridge, or the Devil's Mountain. And weird stuff happens there, But that word, puka, you'll find Puck Lane here, or variants of that. That stuff is telling you something about this. There's a story about the place. Maybe it's weird. It'll have that in the name. So it's a little bit harder in Ireland because you've got to understand the Gaelic to really spot the root of them, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all there, you know. Like things like, you know, like Dublin. The word Dublin is Dublin, which literally means black pool. That's where it comes from. Yeah, Lynn is the word for pool, and Dove is black.
Where's the Black Pool in Dublin?
Well, it used to be considered that the kind of the bay had, or it might have been part of the Liffey as it was going into the bay. Might have been called the Black Pool, but officially in modern Irish, it's called Ballial Tá Clia, which means something along the lines of like town of the Hurdle Pass. It's like that's literally what it means. You know, yeah. Don't ask me why, but someone decided that Dublin wouldn't cut the mustard. So being able to kind of work through the old languages for the places or give us substantial clues, just like the folklore gives substantial clues. But if you break down those kind of 5 patterns, you'll start to see where it comes in. But that's how I think you can identify this type of stuff.
Any final words for the audience?
I would say don't get trapped in looking at this to a very narrow, you know, viewpoint. That's kind of fallen for the wrong way of thinking, you know, with this, or not the wrong way of thinking. It's just, I would say it's just inaccurate, right? It's not accurate. So but at the same time, you know, that doesn't mean rushing up and hugging something. You know, it's like, you know, witches, what used to be called, look at the original names for the witches, right? In Ireland, there was Ban Fiasa, right? That was a wise woman, or Far Fiasa, a wise man. Sometimes they were called fairy doctors because they deal with the fairy world and undo some of the damage if someone bumped up against it. And in England, cunning men, cunning women, because they were cunning, because they could deal with trickster energies and, you know, maybe not get burnt by them, you know, because these are big forces. They don't necessarily understand what it's like to be human or indeed care, you know. So that's what it is. It's just like, be cunning, you know. And buy my book. Right. That's probably my final word.
Yeah. Which you can find anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Darragh, and definitely keep in touch.
Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site. And there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.